The Zent Dominion ruled the galaxy with a suffocating grip, keeping entire worlds under its heel through fear and oppression. For those who dared to resist, there was little mercy. Lyra, a young alien woman gifted with rare psychic abilities, learned this firsthand. Her family, outspoken critics of the Dominion, had been ruthlessly silenced. She'd been taken as a prisoner, and, in a final twist of punishment, handed over as a slave to a human captain. She didn't expect kindness from Captain Marcus Reynolds, a so-called war hero. Humans, after all, were loyal to the Dominion. They were oppressors in their own way. Yet when Marcus received her, his expression held none of the coldness she'd come to expect. Marcus was an imposing figure, tall and sturdy, his military stance commanding respect. But his eyes, unlike the Dominion soldiers she'd known, didn't hold anger or cruelty. They held something else, maybe confusion, perhaps pity, but certainly not hatred. He looked at her with a sort of solemn resignation, as if disgusted with what he saw, though not with her, she realized, but with the very act of enslavement. This realization surprised her and left her feeling oddly unsettled. She waited for him to issue his orders, to assert his power over her in some degrading way. But instead, he seemed reluctant to speak, and when he did, his voice was calm and gentle, so different from the harsh tones she'd grown used to. "I don't believe in this," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I won't force you to do anything, and I won't pretend to understand what you've gone through. But I'm not your enemy, Lyra." Lyra stared at him, her disbelief clear. She felt a flash of anger mixed with suspicion. What game was he playing? She'd been raised to despise humans, to see them as merciless enforcers of the Dominion's cruel order. Marcus's kindness, or whatever this was, made her suspicious, as if he were trying to trick her somehow. Still, his voice, calm and unwavering, left her feeling oddly vulnerable. Days passed, and despite herself, Lyra noticed he remained true to his word. He treated her with respect, giving her space and autonomy she hadn't expected. It was strange to feel even a small semblance of freedom after so much degradation. She held back, her instincts honed to distrust every word, every action. But he was patient. He didn't try to force her to speak, nor did he ask her for anything. It was an odd feeling, to be granted this small respect, and she found herself cautiously watching him, waiting for the catch. Marcus spent most of his days occupied with his work, and she noticed he kept a respectful distance. Yet he always managed to make small gestures that caught her off guard, a blanket folded neatly, an extra portion of food left at her side. Small, unspoken acts that made her wariness fade, even just a little. And though she rarely spoke, she listened. One day, Marcus took a risk. He sat across from her, unarmed and relaxed, his tone soft as he began to tell her about his own life. He spoke of his years of service, of battles fought and friends lost. He mentioned his frustrations with the Zent and his discomfort with their growing power. "I've seen too much bloodshed," he said, his gaze distant. "Too much pain. I thought fighting for them would mean fighting for peace. But it's been nothing but control, oppression." Lyra watched him closely, sensing a strange vulnerability in his words. It was disorienting, hearing a human talk about peace, about discomfort with the Zent. His honesty seemed genuine, and against her better judgment, she found herself feeling something. A faint glimmer of understanding, maybe even empathy. She shook it off, reminding herself that he was still human, a part of the same machine that had destroyed her family. But the walls she'd built up felt a little less secure. In time, Marcus learned bits and pieces of Lyra's story too. He understood that her family had been part of a resistance, that they had been punished simply for standing up to the Zent's tyranny. The more he learned, the harder he found it to reconcile her imprisonment with the person she was, dignified, intelligent, and scarred. He saw in her a strength that had refused to be snuffed out, and it struck him deeply. In one quiet moment, Lyra allowed herself to let down her guard, just slightly. She told him about her family, about their ideals and dreams, all crushed under the Dominion's iron fist. As she spoke, her voice faltered, and Marcus, though silent, listened with unwavering attention, his expression somber. For the first time, she felt a touch of relief, a release of some of the anguish she'd kept buried within her. Marcus didn't respond with empty words or forced sympathies. He simply listened, allowing her pain its rightful space. As the days turned into weeks, the air between them began to change. There was no longer the same tension, the same suspicion. Lyra still held on to her doubts, but she began to see glimpses of a different side to Marcus, a side that defied her expectations. She realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. It was a dangerous thought, one she tried to keep buried, but it grew stronger every day. Once, while Marcus was showing her how to access the ship's basic systems, she felt a strange warmth, a closeness she hadn't felt in years. She caught his gaze, and for a moment, they both seemed to freeze, an unspoken understanding passing between them. He broke eye contact, awkwardly clearing his throat, and she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A dangerous feeling, one she knew could betray her, but she couldn't deny its pull. That evening, she found herself remembering his words, the way he had spoken of his friends lost to the Dominion's wars. She found herself wanting to believe that there were people like him, that humans were capable of kindness, of compassion. The thought was terrifying in its own way, as if it threatened to unravel the very fabric of her worldview. And yet she couldn't deny the warmth that his presence brought, the small comfort of being seen as more than just a weapon, or a prisoner. Still, Lyra couldn't let herself trust him fully, not yet. Her psychic abilities had always been a source of fear for her, something she kept tightly controlled. But with Marcus there were moments when she sensed his emotions, brief flashes of his thoughts. She could feel his sincerity, his frustration with the Dominion, his quiet rebellion. She found herself drawn to these glimpses, unwillingly feeling her defenses soften. Each day she spent with him, she felt her distrust being chipped away, replaced by something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Then came a night when she finally spoke up. In a quiet voice, she asked him why he stayed, why he continued to serve the Zent when he clearly disagreed with them. He looked at her, eyes shadowed with a sadness she hadn't expected. "Sometimes I wonder the same thing," he admitted. "But out here, it's hard to see a way out. Sometimes we're trapped in places we never chose." For the first time, Lyra felt a connection that transcended their circumstances, a shared bond of entrapment, of lives shaped by forces beyond their control. She realized that in his own way, he was as much a prisoner as she was. And though it frightened her, she allowed herself, for the first time, to reach out. As the days turned to weeks, Lyra began to understand that Marcus's kindness wasn't an act, but a natural part of who he was. She'd catch glimpses of him at times, quiet and contemplative, seemingly weighed down by burdens of his own. She couldn't fully grasp why he'd risked the Zent's wrath to show her kindness, but her suspicions had dulled into something resembling curiosity. She noticed how he'd glance at her now and then, as if wanting to ask something but stopping himself. His patience, his restraint, qualities she hadn't expected from any human, let alone one so deeply entrenched in the Dominion's forces, left her unsettled yet strangely drawn in. One evening, as they talked in cautious tones, he asked her about her life before captivity. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share such memories, but something in his gaze, sincere, unassuming, convinced her to speak. In halting words, she spoke of her family's ideals, their defiance of the Zent's tyranny, and the life they'd led before everything was shattered. The words felt foreign, her voice laced with emotion she'd kept buried for so long. But as she spoke, Marcus's quiet attention made her feel heard, truly understood, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Marcus, too, shared fragments of his story, each piece revealing a hidden depth she hadn't expected. He told her of battles fought and friends lost, of the guilt that gnawed at him for remaining part of the Dominion's machinery. The conflicts he described were familiar, yet his perspective was different. He wasn't proud of his rank or his accolades. He seemed almost resentful of them. She began to see that his defiance, though quieter than her own family's, ran just as deep. He wasn't her enemy, not really. He was a reluctant participant, bound by forces beyond his control, just as she was. In these shared stories, they found a bridge across the gulf that had once separated them. Marcus's compassion softened the hard edges of her distrust, and she found herself gradually opening up, sharing bits and pieces of her life, her fears, and her pain. And he, in turn, responded with an understanding that went beyond words. He never offered empty platitudes or tried to downplay her suffering. He simply listened, creating a space where she felt safe to unravel the tangled emotions she'd carried. The more they talked, the more she saw him not as a soldier of the Zen but as an individual with his own struggles, his own quiet rebellion. There was a moment, brief yet powerful, when she glimpsed his regret and self-doubt, feelings that resonated with her deeply. She saw in him the echoes of her own guilt, her own sense of helplessness. They were both scarred, bound by a system they despised, yet somehow surviving within its constraints. The bond between them grew from this shared pain, this mutual recognition of wounds inflicted by a common oppressor. Her psychic abilities, long suppressed and feared, began to surface in subtle ways around Marcus. She could sense his emotions at times, faint yet unmistakable, the quiet sorrow, the simmering anger, the occasional flashes of tenderness. It startled her at first, this uninvited glimpse into his mind, but she didn't resist it. Instead, she found herself drawn to these flashes, compelled to understand the man who, despite everything, had treated her with respect and care. His emotions weren't a manipulation or a ploy, they were raw and genuine, reflecting a depth she hadn't expected. She began to trust him, cautiously, though she still kept her guard up. Trust, for her, was fragile, something she had learned to protect fiercely. But Marcus never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. His patience was unwavering, a quiet strength that reassured her in ways she couldn't articulate. He didn't expect her to change overnight. He seemed content to let her grow comfortable at her own pace, creating a foundation of trust that felt solid and real. One night, as they shared a rare moment of quiet, Lyra asked him why he continued to serve the Dominion if he resented them so much. His answer was simple yet profound. "Sometimes it's not about choice," he said, his voice laced with a resigned sadness. "Sometimes survival means staying where you are, even if it breaks you." She felt the weight of those words, understanding them all too well. It was a truth she'd lived with her entire life, a truth she could finally share with someone who understood. As they spoke, the unspoken grew louder between them, a fragile connection built on shared pain and empathy. Lyra found herself wanting to believe in him, wanting to let go of the walls she'd constructed. She sensed the same struggle within him, the same reluctance to expose his vulnerability. Yet, with every shared story, every quiet conversation, they chipped away at the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. He became more than a captor, more than a human. He became an ally, perhaps even a friend, though she was hesitant to name it as such. In the days that followed, their bond grew stronger, though it remained unspoken. They moved through routines with an ease that felt natural, as if they'd known each other far longer than they actually had. She began to see him as someone who had the power to help, not hurt, someone who, despite being on the opposite side, could understand the depth of her suffering. And in return, he began to look at her not as a prisoner but as a person, a survivor whose resilience matched his own. Then, one day, something changed. They were alerted to the Zent's increased interest in Marcus, a suspicion brewing among his superiors that he was growing too sympathetic, too lenient. He confided in her, his face etched with worry. This was the first real danger they'd faced together, a direct threat to the fragile world they'd built. She could see the fear in his eyes, not for himself but for her. It was a selfless fear, the kind she never expected to see from a human. As they discussed their options, Lyra felt an unfamiliar resolve harden within her. For so long, she had hidden her powers, afraid of drawing attention. But now, faced with the threat of losing the only person who had treated her with dignity, she realized she could no longer remain passive. She offered to use her psychic abilities to help them evade detection, a gesture of trust that spoke volumes. Marcus hesitated, wary of endangering her further, but she insisted. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice, and she chose to protect him, just as he had protected her. Their escape plan grew out of this mutual trust, each relying on the other's strengths. Marcus's tactical knowledge and her psychic abilities combined in ways that surprised them both, creating a dynamic that felt almost instinctual. Their teamwork was seamless, a blend of skill and intuition that spoke to the bond they had forged. In those moments, as they prepared for the journey ahead, she felt a sense of unity that went beyond words. It was as if, together, they could face anything. In the midst of this danger, something shifted between them. There were no words to define it, no labels or expectations. It was simply a connection, an understanding that they were no longer alone, that their fates were intertwined in a way either had foreseen. She found herself standing beside him, not as a prisoner or a pawn, but as an equal. And for the first time, she dared to hope that, perhaps, they could find freedom, not just from the Zent, but from the burdens they carried within themselves. Their escape would be fraught with peril, but the fear that once dominated her thoughts had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. She knew now that Marcus wasn't just a chance encounter or a temporary ally. He was someone who had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, who had listened when she expected silence. And in turn, she had offered him a trust she hadn't known she could give. As they prepared to leave, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about escaping the Zent. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. With Marcus by her side, she felt, for the first time, that perhaps freedom was within reach. Their escape began in silence, a shared look and a single nod as they both understood the risk ahead. Marcus's experience in tactical maneuvers had allowed them to slip past the initial Zent patrols, but the danger loomed closer with every step. The Zent were no strangers to rebellion, and they monitored their soldiers with a diligence that bordered on paranoia. Marcus had used his rank to move unnoticed thus far, but he knew the moment they broke away entirely, the full weight of the Dominion would descend upon them. Lyra's senses, heightened from years of captivity, were sharp. Every noise, every flicker of movement around them heightened her awareness, feeding her already well-honed survival instincts. She felt Marcus's tension, sensed his quiet dread even without needing her psychic abilities. Yet his resolve was unwavering. His movements were swift, precise, and she followed him without hesitation, trusting him as she never thought she'd trust another. He had become her only true ally, and in the grip of the Dominion's merciless pursuit, he was now her partner in every sense. As they moved deeper into enemy territory, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, every inch filled with the threat of discovery. She could sense the fear under Marcus's calm exterior, a fear that mirrored her own, but there was something else in him, something she couldn't quite name. It was as though he believed they might actually succeed, as if escaping the Zent's clutches wasn't entirely impossible. That spark of hope, faint but present, made her resolve strengthen. For the first time, she wasn't just running to survive, she was running for something, a future that was hers to shape, free from the Zent's control. Their first close encounter came when they reached the perimeter of the outpost. Marcus motioned for her to stay silent, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the Zent's patrol drones. They both knew these outposts were heavily guarded, monitored with precision. One misstep, one sound, and the Zent would close in, trapping them in an iron grip that neither of them could escape. Lyra steadied her breath, calming her racing heart, her senses attuned to Marcus's every movement. They slipped through the darkness, Marcus's presence beside her both grounding and nerve-wracking. But then, as if summoned by fate, the distant hum of a patrol drone broke through the silence. Marcus tensed, his body coiling, ready to act. Lyra knew she couldn't let fear control her now, and she reached out with her mind, concentrating on the drone's signal, trying to sense its movement. With each passing second, her concentration grew more intense, until she finally managed to divert its path, veering it just slightly away from them. It worked. Marcus shot her a look of surprise and approval as the drone floated harmlessly away. She felt a rush of relief, followed by a realization of the power she'd barely begun to understand. Her abilities were evolving, growing stronger, and in these critical moments, they were no longer a burden or a source of fear. They were her weapon, her defense. And with Marcus's guidance, she was learning how to wield them in ways she never imagined. Hours passed, each moment fraught with tension. The Zen soldiers were relentless, methodical, but Marcus's skills proved invaluable. He had led them through narrow escapes, using his knowledge of military patterns to stay one step ahead. But the Zen were closing in, and they both knew it. Lyra's powers helped them sense the soldiers before they could be seen, a fragile advantage that kept them moving forward. Her bond with Marcus grew more profound with each shared glance, each unspoken word. Their survival was no longer just a matter of tactics. It was a matter of connection, a trust that had become as vital as air. But trust alone couldn't guarantee their escape. Their luck began to falter as they encountered a checkpoint. This time, there was no easy way around it, no quiet path to safety. Marcus glanced at her, his eyes filled with an unspoken apology, and she realized he was preparing to give himself up if it meant she could escape. The thought sent a surge of anger and desperation through her, emotions she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't let him sacrifice himself, not for her. She couldn't lose the one person who had seen her, understood her. Without warning, her powers surged, stronger than ever, and she reached out with her mind, touching the Zen soldiers who stood between them and freedom. A single thought, her pain, her anguish, her memories of captivity, unleashed into their minds like a tidal wave. She felt their confusion, their hesitation, as her memories became theirs, a blinding flood of emotion that overwhelmed their senses. She didn't let up, didn't hesitate, until she felt them retreat, their fear driving them away from the very gate they guarded. Marcus, watching in stunned silence, seemed to realize the true extent of her powers. She was no longer just his companion, she was a force to be reckoned with, a weapon the Zen had underestimated. He didn't question her actions, didn't ask how or why. He simply took her hand, a silent agreement that they would continue, that her power was now their shared weapon. They moved forward, leaving the checkpoint behind, the path stretching into the unknown. But Lyra could sense something, a presence, an awareness that extended far beyond the Zen soldiers in their immediate vicinity. It was as if her mind had brushed against a network, a vast, interconnected consciousness. The Zen suppression, their cruelty, it was no longer an abstract idea but a living, breathing entity, a presence that stretched across the galaxy. This new awareness terrified her, yet it also strengthened her resolve. She realized her powers could reach others, that her mind could touch those suffering under the Zen's rule. Her connection with Marcus had shown her that empathy, even across species, was possible. And now, with her powers unleashed, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. She could no longer ignore the voices, the silent cries for freedom that echoed through her mind. With each step, Lyra's connection with Marcus deepened, their shared purpose solidifying into a force that defied the Zen's cruelty. Their journey was no longer just about themselves, it was about a future free from oppression, a galaxy where no one had to endure the suffering they had faced. She felt Marcus's hope mingle with her own, a hope that grew stronger, fiercer, with every near escape, every obstacle overcome. Finally, they reached a ship, their last chance for freedom. As they prepared to board, Lyra felt a wave of emotions flood through her, fear, relief, determination. Marcus, standing beside her, seemed to sense it too. He looked at her, a silent promise in his eyes, a vow that they would see this through together. She knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever battles they would face, they were no longer alone. They were partners, bound not by circumstance but by choice, by a shared dream that defied the Zen's tyranny. As the ship took off, Lyra felt a connection surge through her, a final, powerful wave of emotion that extended beyond Marcus, beyond herself. It was the spark of rebellion, the voices of the oppressed rising in unison, a collective cry for freedom that echoed through her mind. And in that moment, she knew their escape was more than just a single act of defiance. It was the beginning of a revolution. They found themselves on the neutral planet at last, a place free from the Zen's oppressive gaze. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lyra felt the air fill her lungs without the weight of fear. The world around them was vibrant, alive with color and warmth, a stark contrast to the dim, mechanical gloom of the Zent's territories. She and Marcus walked through bustling streets of unfamiliar but welcoming faces, and with every step, the reality of their freedom settled over them, filling the spaces left raw and hollow by years of captivity and conflict. Lyra could hardly believe it. She'd spent so long as a prisoner, a pawn in the Zent's cruel games, that freedom felt almost surreal. She glanced at Marcus, who wore the same cautious, tentative expression, as if he too was trying to accept that this life, this world, could be theirs now. They had each survived their own hells, but now, here they were, side by side in a place that offered a chance to build something new, something untouched by the Zent's reach. Their connection, forged in fear and desperation, had grown into something far deeper, something that neither of them could easily name but both felt keenly. Lyra knew she'd found more than an ally in Marcus. He had become her confidant, her partner, someone who had seen her darkest moments, and chosen to stand by her. Their relationship, once fragile and uncertain, had solidified into something unbreakable, a bond that had endured even the Zent's relentless pursuit. In this quiet moment of safety, they talked of things they'd never dared to dream before. They shared visions of what life could be like, of how they could use their newfound freedom to do more than just survive. They dreamed of a life with purpose, a life that honored those who'd suffered under the Zent's rule. Lyra spoke of her family, of her desire to honor their memory by helping others break free from the Zent's tyranny. Marcus listened, his eyes soft with understanding, and she knew he shared the same purpose. They had escaped, but neither of them could ignore the countless others still trapped, still suffering. Their escape had set something in motion, a spark that they couldn't allow to die. And so, they chose to make a public commitment, not only to each other but to their shared cause. They decided to marry, a union that would symbolize more than just love. It would be a message to the galaxy. In their marriage, they saw the potential for unity between species, a reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion and resilience could bridge divides. They kept the ceremony simple, a quiet declaration surrounded by a few locals who'd come to know their story. But news of their union spread quickly, reaching distant planets and oppressed worlds where hope was in short supply. To those who'd only known the Zent's iron grip, their marriage became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that freedom was within reach, that alliances could be formed even among unlikely allies. Lyra's powers had evolved in ways she could barely comprehend. Her psychic connection now extended across great distances, a web of thoughts and emotions that linked her to others who shared her pain, her dreams. She could feel them, countless voices reaching out, hesitant but hopeful. And through her connection, she shared her memories, her experiences with Marcus, showing them that even in captivity, there could be kindness, even in conflict, there could be love. Her mind reached those still in bondage, planting seeds of defiance that spread like wildfire, igniting the faint sparks of rebellion across the galaxy. In time, their story reached even the Zent's inner circles, where whispers of a human and alien couple defying the Dominion's rules stirred unrest. Their marriage, once a personal act of love and defiance, had grown into a movement. Across planets, oppressed beings began to resist, emboldened by the story of Marcus and Lyra's escape, their unity, their determination. The Zent, used to quelling uprisings with brute force, found themselves facing a different kind of rebellion, one that couldn't be silenced with violence alone. The idea of unity between species, the notion that compassion could break even the most unyielding chains, was a threat they couldn't control. In their small home on the neutral planet, Lyra and Marcus watched as the galaxy began to shift. News reached them of planets where the Zent's control had weakened, of soldiers who deserted, inspired by stories of a human who had defied his own kind to protect an alien, and of an alien who had used her gifts not for revenge but to inspire hope. Their actions, once motivated by a simple desire to survive, had blossomed into something larger than themselves. Their love, their unity, was changing the very fabric of the galaxy. Despite the hope they'd ignited, the threat of the Zent remained, a shadow lingering over every victory. Lyra and Marcus knew they couldn't rest, not yet. They reached out to others, forming alliances with rebel leaders, using Lyra's powers to share strategies and provide guidance. Marcus's knowledge of the Dominion's tactics proved invaluable, and with each successful act of defiance, the Zent's influence grew weaker. They became leaders, not by title but by choice, their actions driven by a desire to see others freed from the chains they themselves had once worn. There were moments when the burden felt overwhelming, times when Lyra wondered if they'd ever see the galaxy truly free. But Marcus was always there, steady and unwavering, his presence a constant reminder of what they'd achieved and what they still had to fight for. In their quiet moments, he'd remind her of the lives they'd touched, of the people who'd found courage through their story. And though their journey was far from over, she knew they would face it together, their strength drawn from the bond they'd forged in the fires of oppression and defiance. As the galaxy began to shift, the Zent's power waned, a gradual but undeniable decline fueled by the countless voices that had risen in defiance. Marcus and Lyra's story had become more than just a tale of love, it had become a legend, a testament to the power of unity and resilience. And in the years that followed, as they watched the Dominion's control fracture and fade, they found solace in knowing that their journey, their sacrifice, had sparked a change that would endure long after they were gone. In the quiet moments, when the weight of their struggle faded, they allowed themselves to dream of a world where peace could flourish. They spoke of future generations, of children who would grow up in a galaxy free from the Zent's reach, a galaxy where compassion had triumphed over cruelty. Their love had begun as an act of rebellion, a defiance of the forces that sought to control them. But in the end, it had become a beacon, a guiding light that had spread across worlds, uniting beings of every kind in a shared hope for freedom. Their story continued to spread, passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, love and resilience could bring about change. And though they'd started as unlikely allies, bound by circumstance, they had become something far greater, a symbol of what could be achieved when individuals chose to stand together against oppression. Their journey had transformed them, had transformed the galaxy, proving that compassion, even in the face of tyranny, held a power that could never be extinguished.